There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their minds. It involves mud. It involves courage. It involves young men from quiet towns who answered the call of their nations and paid with their lives in ways that were tragic, but somehow dignified. That version is not exactly false, but it is incomplete in ways that historians have spent more than 100 years trying to correct, and in many cases, failing to correct. Because the truth of that war is not the kind of truth that fits comfortably into a commemorative ceremony or a school textbook or a bronze statue standing in a town square. The truth of World War I is mechanical. It is administrative. It is the truth of a civilization that built systems capable of processing human beings at industrial scale, and then ran those systems for 4 years with the consistency of a factory shift schedule. And then, when it was over, wrote official histories that described what had happened in language careful enough to prevent the full weight of it from ever landing on anyone who had not been there. This is not a story about monsters. That is perhaps the most disturbing part of it. The men who organized the logistics of the Western Front were not sadists. The officers who sent units over the top into concentrated machine gun fire were not indifferent to human life in any simple sense. The medical officers who processed the wounded and catalogued the dead were not without feeling. What they were, and what the entire institutional apparatus of every major combatant nation became over the course of those 4 years, was adapted. They adapted to conditions that should have been intolerable. They developed habits, procedures, reflexes, administrative routines, and professional customs that allowed them to function inside a situation that had no precedent in the history of organized violence, and many of those habits were so deeply embedded in military culture, medical practice, bureaucratic procedure, and collective psychology that historians are still tracking their reverberations into the present day. This is about those habits, not the ones in the history books, the ones that were recorded in medical journals and then quietly reclassified, the ones that appear in soldiers' letters that were censored before they left the post, the ones that show up in the gap between what the official casualty report said and what the burial records actually showed, the ones that explain why certain phrases, certain procedures, certain silences appeared with such consistency across armies that had nothing in common except the fact that they were all caught inside the same machine. To understand what World War I did to the people who fought it, you have to start by understanding what it was not. It was not the war that anyone had planned for. The German military had spent decades refining the Schlieffen Plan, a sweeping offensive designed to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks before turning east to deal with Russia. The French had their own offensive doctrine, built on the idea that aggressive spirit, what they called élan, would carry the day against any opponent. The British Army was small but professional, trained for colonial campaigns in places like South Africa and India, not for the kind of sustained continental warfare that was coming. Every major power on the continent had war plans that assumed the conflict would be decided in months, possibly weeks, through rapid maneuver and decisive battle. None of those plans survived contact with the reality that emerged in the late summer and fall of 1914. By October of that year, the war of movement was over. The armies had dug in along a line that stretched roughly 440 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The trenches were supposed to be temporary. In French military doctrine, there was almost no conceptual framework for static warfare, no doctrine, no specialized training, no vocabulary even, for what was happening. The orders continued to emphasize the offensive, the advance, the attack. And so the attacks came, and the machine guns and the artillery and the barbed wire stopped them, and the men fell, and the line did not move, and the orders came again. The first habit that historians find consistently disturbing is one that emerged very quickly in that early period and never really stopped. The habit of continuing to order attacks after it was already clear that the attack had failed. This was not stupidity, or at least, it was not only stupidity. It was the product of a genuine tactical and communicative problem that the technology of 1914 was completely unable to solve. Once an attack was underway, the men who had ordered it lost contact with the men carrying it out almost immediately. The telephone lines were cut by artillery. The runners sent to gather information were killed. The smoke and noise made visual observation impossible from any position that was not itself being shelled. The commanders sitting in their headquarters, working from maps that showed positions that had been accurate 12 hours ago, had almost no reliable way to know what was happening at the front. And so they worked from what they had. They had the plan. They had the objective. They had the understanding, based on doctrine, based on theory, based on the lessons of previous wars, that a determined assault by sufficient numbers would eventually overcome resistance. And they had the knowledge that stopping an attack mid-execution, pulling back the reserves, abandoning the objectives, would cost them their careers, would cost them the confidence of their superiors, would cost their nation ground and time and strategic initiative. And so the attacks were reinforced rather than halted. Men were fed into positions where men had already died, and they died in the same ways, and the reports that came back were processed and filed, and the orders were written for the next attempt. This habit of institutional momentum, of continuing a course of action because the alternative was an admission of failure, shaped the entire trajectory of the war on every front. It explains Verdun, where the French and German armies between them suffered close to 1 million casualties over 10 months in a battle that neither side had the ability to stop once it had started, because stopping would have meant explaining to someone why it had started in the first place. It explains the Somme, where on the first day alone the British army took nearly 60,000 casualties, nearly 20,000 of them killed, and the offensive continued for 4.5 more months. It explains the repeated offensives at Ypres, at Arras, at the Chemin des Dames, each one launched with the conviction that this time the preparation would be sufficient, the artillery would cut the wire, the infantry would get through, and each one producing casualty lists that the medical corps processed with the same efficiency they had developed for all the others. The second disturbing habit was the systematic management of what those casualties actually looked like. Every army at war exercises control over information. That is expected, understandable, built into the logic of military operations. But what the major powers of World War I developed was something more specific and more comprehensive than ordinary wartime censorship. They developed a system for managing the emotional and psychological relationship between the home front and the physical reality of what was happening to the men they had sent. The letters that soldiers sent home were read by censors and marked, and any content that described specific conditions, specific locations, specific numbers of dead, specific details of wounds or deaths, was removed. Not because it was tactically sensitive in most cases, but because it was psychologically dangerous. Because the people at home were being told that the war was proceeding, that sacrifices were being made, that the cause was just, and the effort was organized. And letters describing men drowning in shell craters filled with water and blood, or men living with rats that had grown fat on the bodies of the unburied dead, or men who had stopped being able to speak after a week of continuous artillery bombardment. Those letters told a different story. What made this habit particularly significant was the way it shaped collective memory in real time. The people at home built their understanding of the war from what they were allowed to receive. The newspapers, which were also censored, the official communiques, the carefully managed photographs, the speeches, the casualty notices that listed names but not circumstances. All of it created a version of the war that was happening simultaneously with the war itself, running alongside it, consistently cleaner and more coherent and more meaningful than the actual thing. And because most people's primary experience of the war was mediated through these systems, the gap between the official version and the lived version was preserved even after the war ended, because the people who came home often did not have the language or the will or the opportunity to describe what they had actually experienced, and the people who had stayed home had been thoroughly prepared to receive a particular kind of story. And anything that did not fit that story was difficult to hear and difficult to tell. The third habit involves something that the medical literature of the period handles with extraordinary care, and which historians of military medicine have described as one of the most significant and least acknowledged institutional failures of the entire war. It involves the treatment of what was called shell shock, a term that itself reflects the confusion and denial that surrounded the condition from the beginning. The men who began presenting with symptoms that we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or in some cases what we might describe as acute psychosis or complete psychological collapse, appeared in numbers that the medical apparatus of every army was utterly unprepared for. They could not speak. They could not walk. They trembled continuously. They were blind without physical cause. They were deaf without physical cause. They relived events in ways that could not be interrupted. They starved themselves. They could not sleep, or they could not wake. They presented in their hundreds, and then their thousands, and then their tens of thousands, and the medical system had to decide what to do with them. The decision that was reached, not as an explicit policy in most cases, but as an emergent institutional habit, was to treat them as a disciplinary problem. The initial assumption, which persisted in various forms throughout the war, despite accumulating evidence to the contrary, was that men who broke down psychologically were men who had chosen, at some level, to avoid duty. The term used in British military culture was lack of moral fibre. The assumption was that proper soldiers, men of good character, did not suffer these symptoms, and therefore men who did suffer them were either constitutionally deficient, meaning they should never have been recruited in the first place, or they were cowards, meaning they could be returned to duty through pressure, punishment, or the threat of consequences. Neither assumption was accurate. Neither was modified in response to evidence as quickly as the evidence warranted. The treatment of shell shock cases ranged from simple rest and return to duty, which in many cases produced temporary remission followed by complete collapse, to electrotherapy, in which electrical current was applied to the body of a man already in severe psychological distress in the belief that the pain and discomfort would motivate recovery, to simple imprisonment. Men who broke down in the line were sometimes arrested for cowardice. Some were court-martialed. Some were executed. The British Army executed over 300 men during the war for offences including cowardice and desertion, and the medical evidence in many of those cases, where it survives, suggests that a significant proportion of them were men whose psychological state would, under any contemporary standard of clinical evaluation, have made them unfit to stand trial, let alone face execution. This is a fact that the British government formally acknowledged decades after the war ended, when it issued posthumous pardons to those men. But the acknowledgement came so long after the fact that its significance was largely absorbed as a historical footnote rather than a reckoning. The fourth habit is closely related to the third, and it concerns the way the armies of the First World War handled the relationship between men who were physically capable of continuing to function and men who were not. The system of reliefs, rotations, and leaves that each army operated was designed, at least in theory, to prevent men from reaching the breaking point by rotating them out of the line before the cumulative stress became irreversible. In practice, the demands of the front, the casualties that were constantly thinning the units that were supposed to be in reserve, the administrative complexity of moving large numbers of men through a system that was perpetually short of transport and personnel, meant that the rotations happened less frequently and less regularly than the theoretical models predicted. Men spent longer in the line than they were supposed to. They spent longer in the forward positions, the ones under direct fire, the ones where sleep was impossible, and the bodies of the unburied dead were an inescapable physical presence. They spent longer in the conditions that the medical literature was beginning to identify as reliably producing psychological breakdown, and the system continued to process them as though the theoretical model was working, because the records showed reliefs happening, leaves being granted, men being rotated, and the gap between what the records showed and what the men experienced was not something that the records were designed to capture. The fifth habit is one that took historians several decades to fully recognize, because it is embedded in the relationship between armies and the dead. Every military force has procedures for dealing with its casualties. They are necessary procedures, logistically and legally and symbolically. What the First World War produced was a new scale of casualties that overwhelmed every existing procedure and forced the development of new ones, and some of the new ones reflect an attitude toward the human body and toward individual identity that is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the rhetoric of honor and sacrifice that surrounded the war's official presentation. The problem, at its most basic, was numbers. On a heavy day of fighting on the Western Front, an attacking division might suffer thousands of casualties in a matter of hours. The dead had to be moved, identified if possible, and either buried or recorded. In practice, identification was often impossible. The nature of high-explosive artillery, which was the primary cause of death on the Western Front, was such that it frequently destroyed bodies so completely that individual identification was not feasible. Men were recorded as killed in action with no known grave. This happened to a substantial fraction of all deaths. On the Thiepval Memorial, which commemorates British and South African dead of the Somme who have no known grave, there are 72,000 names. That is one memorial for one offensive for two national forces. The Menin Gate at Ypres commemorates another 54,000. The French have the Douaumont ossuary at Verdun, which contains the commingled skeletal remains of an estimated 130,000 unidentified soldiers from both sides. These are not numbers, or rather, they are numbers, and that is the point, because the administrative processing of the dead at the scale the First World War required that the individual identity of each man become secondary to the logistical management of the body. The paperwork was done. The next of kin notification was sent. The grave registration unit moved on. The war continued. The sixth habit is one that the institutional histories of the First World War are particularly reluctant to discuss, which is the routine use of men who were medically unfit for frontline service in frontline positions. Not in cases of emergency, not in the final desperate months of 1918 when German reserves had been exhausted, but as a consistent feature of the war from relatively early on. The problem was that the recruiting systems of all the major powers had processed men quickly in the initial period of mobilization, and the standards that were applied in that initial period were not always rigorous. Men with conditions that should have disqualified them from frontline service were passed through. And then, once they were in the system, once they were trained and equipped and assigned to units, the institutional pressure was strongly against removing them. Every man removed from a unit was a reduction in that unit's strength, and strength was the currency of the Western Front. Units were expected to maintain their establishment. Officers were judged partly on their ability to keep their units at fighting strength. And so men with conditions that were known to their medical officers, conditions documented in their files, remained in frontline positions because the alternative was an administrative complication that the system had not been designed to accommodate efficiently. The seventh habit concerns the relationship between artillery and infantry, and specifically the way that the institutions of the major powers handled the fact that their own artillery was killing their own men at a rate that was not militarily acceptable, but was routinely accepted anyway. The problem of short rounds, of shells falling short of their targets and into positions occupied by friendly forces, was universal, technically unavoidable given the manufacturing tolerances of mass-produced shells and the wear of artillery barrels, and extensively documented. The records of virtually every major engagement on the Western Front contain reports of casualties caused by friendly fire, and those reports were processed and filed, and the artillery continued its work because the alternative was not using the artillery, and not using the artillery was not an option the tactical doctrine of any major power was prepared to consider. The artillery was the primary instrument of offensive operations. It was supposed to cut the wire and suppress the defenders and prepare the way for the infantry. That it was also, with reliable frequency, killing the infantry was a cost that was absorbed into the casualty figures without being broken out in any way that would make it legible as a distinct category of institutional failure. The eighth habit is perhaps the most banal and in some ways the most revealing. It is the habit of paperwork. Every death, every wound, every disciplinary action, every court-martial, every instance of leave denied and leave granted, every case of trench foot, every case of self-inflicted wound, every instance of venereal disease, which was treated as a disciplinary matter rather than a medical one in the British Army for most of the war, every promotion and every demotion, every shell fired and every shell that failed to fire, every ration issued and every ration that did not arrive, all of it was documented. The armies of the First World War were extraordinary bureaucratic enterprises. They generated paper at a scale that has kept military historians employed for more than a century. And what the paper shows, consistently and across all the major armies, is that the administrative systems were functioning. The forms were being filled in, the procedures were being followed, the reports were being written and filed and transmitted up the chain of command. The bureaucratic body of the war was working even while the human body of the war was being consumed at a rate that the bureaucracy itself was recording. This is the thing that disturbs historians most persistently about the First World War. Not that it was chaotic, not that the systems failed, but that the systems worked. The logistical systems, the supply systems, the administrative systems, the replacement systems that took men from civilian life, trained them, equipped them, moved them to the front, fed them into the line, and then recorded their deaths or wounds and began processing their replacements. Those systems were impressively functional. The war consumed men, and the machinery of the war processed that consumption with professional efficiency. And the gap between the efficiency of the processing and the human reality of what was being processed is the gap that the official histories of the First World War have been trying to paper over ever since. The ninth habit concerns the treatment of soldiers who attempted to wound themselves to escape frontline service. Self-inflicted wounds were treated in all the major armies as a serious disciplinary offense, potentially capital in the British case, and the detection and prosecution of self-inflicted wounds was a significant part of the work of the military medical corps. The reason historians find this habit disturbing is not the disciplinary response itself, which reflects a coherent, if harsh, military logic, but the numbers. The number of men who were willing to deliberately injure themselves, to shoot off a finger or expose a hand above the parapet at a moment when they knew snipers were active, to burn their skin with chemical accelerants, or create infections by driving foreign matter into wounds. The number of men who were willing to do these things and face the very real possibility of prosecution, court-martial, and punishment as an alternative to remaining in the line is a number that speaks directly to the conditions in the line. It is a measure of what those conditions were doing to the people inside them. The medical literature on self-inflicted wounds from the First World War is significant and largely unpublicized. The rates varied considerably by period and by theater, peaking during the most sustained and costly offensives and dropping during periods of relative quiet. The patterns match what you would expect from a population of men responding rationally to conditions of extreme stress, which is to say they do not reflect moral failure of the kind that the military discipline system was designed to address. They reflect human beings responding to an environment that exceeded what human beings can reasonably be expected to endure, and doing so in the most direct way available to them. The military system processed those responses as disciplinary problems because it had no other category for them, and the men who were processed as disciplinary problems were, in a significant number of cases, returned to the line after their punishment, where they had another opportunity to respond to conditions of extreme stress, and the cycle continued. The 10th habit is one that spans the medical and the administrative in a way that makes it particularly difficult to categorize. It concerns the management of information about the physical deterioration of men held in the line for extended periods. This is separate from the psychological deterioration that shell shock represented. This is the straightforward physical question of what happens to the human body when it is kept in the conditions of the Western Front trench system for weeks and months at a time. The trench system of the Western Front was a unique environment in the history of warfare. Men lived in it continuously, They ate in it, slept in it, defecated in it, and occasionally died in it. The sanitation was inadequate. The water table in Flanders was so high that the trenches flooded regularly, and men stood in water and mud for periods that could last days. The condition known as trench foot, a form of tissue damage caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, was epidemic. In the first winter of the war, the British Army alone suffered tens of thousands of cases. Trench foot, at its most severe, results in tissue death, gangrene, and amputation. Men lost feet. They lost legs. The condition was almost entirely preventable by the regular changing of socks and dry rest periods, both of which the conditions of the front made extremely difficult to provide consistently. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had lice. The delousing procedures that the armies developed, passing clothing through steam, running men through bathing facilities, were partially effective and had to be repeated continuously because reinfection was inevitable as long as men returned to the same environment. The lice were not merely uncomfortable. They were the vector for trench fever caused by the bacterium now known as Bartonella quintana, which produced recurring fevers, severe headaches, and muscle pain, and which could incapacitate a man for weeks. The medical corps knew about the connection between lice and trench fever from relatively early in the war, and the knowledge did not significantly change the conditions that perpetuated the problem, because the conditions were the front, and the front was the front. And changing the fundamental physical conditions of the front was not a thing the military administrative system had the capacity or the inclination to do. The 11th habit concerns the industrial production of ammunition and the men employed to produce it, but it connects to the front in a way that is rarely discussed in the same breath as the experiences of combat soldiers. The shell-filling factories of Britain, France, and Germany employed hundreds of thousands of workers, a substantial proportion of them women, in conditions that produced their own category of physical destruction. The TNT and cordite and other explosive compounds that those workers handled every day caused a condition known colloquially as toxic jaundice, produced by trinitrotoluene poisoning, which turned the skin yellow, damaged the liver, and in serious cases killed. Women who worked in those factories were called canary girls in Britain because the TNT turned their skin and hair yellow. The records show hundreds of deaths from toxic jaundice in the British munitions factories alone. The management of those factories knew the cause. The industrial medical literature of the period documented the risks. The production targets did not change. The workers continued to fill shells. The shells were sent to France and fired into positions that sometimes turned out to contain the people who had filled them, or people very much like them. The 12th habit is one that is embedded in the language the war produced, specifically in the gap between that language and the realities it was used to describe. The military vocabulary of the First World War developed its own euphemisms with impressive speed, partly through official management of information, and partly through the organic process by which people under extreme stress develop linguistic systems that allow them to describe their situation at a remove from its full weight. Casualties were taken, positions were consolidated, objectives were achieved at great cost. Men were missing in action, units sustained heavy casualties and were withdrawn to reform. Each of these phrases has a precise bureaucratic meaning, and each of them can be applied to situations of extreme human catastrophe in a way that renders those situations legible to administrative processing without requiring the processing system to engage with the full human content of what it is handling. This habit of euphemistic bureaucratic language was not peculiar to the First World War, but the First World War produced it at a scale and with a systematization that had not previously been seen, and that left a legacy in the administrative language of every subsequent major conflict. The vocabulary of official military communication that came out of the First World War, the frameworks for casualty reporting, the procedures for next-of-kin notification, the formats for operational reports, were adapted and developed and carried forward into the Second World War and beyond, and traces of their original form are visible in the bureaucratic language of military operations to the present day. The 13th habit is one that the social history of the war has explored, but that still surprises people encountering it for the first time. It concerns the relationship between officers and enlisted men, and specifically the way that the class dynamics of the major European armies shaped the distribution of risk, protection, and institutional support in ways that the official equality of military service systematically obscured. Officers in the British Army came overwhelmingly from the middle and upper classes. The senior officers who directed operations lived in conditions that, while not comfortable in any absolute sense, were meaningfully different from the conditions in the forward trenches where their men lived. They ate differently, they slept differently, they were exposed to different levels of direct physical risk, and they had access to different systems of support when they suffered psychologically. A working-class private who broke down psychologically was likely to be handled by a system that defaulted to the assumption that he was malingering. An officer who broke down was more likely to be sent for rest and recuperation, to be seen by a medical officer who had professional and social reasons to take his condition seriously, to receive a diagnosis that attributed his symptoms to physical rather than psychological cause, to be handled in a way that preserved both his dignity and his military record. The data on court-martials for cowardice show the class distribution of those proceedings with brutal clarity. The men who were shot for cowardice and desertion were overwhelmingly from the working class. The officers who broke down in equivalent ways were, with significant frequency, managed through systems that did not produce court-martials. This is not an absolute distinction. Officers were shot, and working-class men were treated with more care than the average. But the pattern is consistent enough that it shows up in the statistics, and the statistics were produced by the administrative system of a military that described itself as giving every man an equal chance. The 14th habit concerns the management of the wounded in relation to the ongoing needs of the offensive, and it is one of the more straightforward examples of human expendability as institutional policy rather than individual cruelty. The system for evacuating the wounded from the forward areas was built around the principle that the offensive must not be disrupted. This meant that during the preparatory phases of a major attack, the casualty clearing stations behind the lines were deliberately not pre-stocked with supplies in quantities that would accommodate the casualties that the planners knew the attack would produce, because pre-stocking at that scale would have indicated to enemy intelligence that an attack was imminent. The medical corps knew what was coming. The medical officers knew that the attacks would produce thousands of casualties in the first hours, and that the evacuation and treatment system would be overwhelmed. They knew this because they had the casualty estimates from the planning process. And the attacks happened and the casualties came and the system was overwhelmed, and men who might have survived with prompt treatment died because the treatment was delayed, and that was recorded in the after-action medical reports that were written, filed, and used to plan the next offensive under the same constraints. The 15th habit concerns the use of gas, specifically the institutional management of a weapon that everyone involved knew was producing a category of suffering that was difficult to process even by the standards that the war had established for itself. Gas was introduced by the Germans at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, a chlorine release that produced mass casualties among Allied troops who had no protection against it and no framework for understanding what was happening. The Allied powers responded by developing their own gas capabilities, and the war became a sustained chemical experiment, with each side developing new agents and the other side developing new protections, and the cycle producing progressively more sophisticated toxicological weapons and progressively more sophisticated but never fully adequate defensive equipment. The soldiers who suffered gas casualties occupied a particular position in the military medical literature of the period. The injuries they presented were often less immediately lethal than the injuries produced by artillery and small arms, but they were more prolonged, more painful over the course of the injury, and more debilitating in ways that persisted long after the immediate exposure. Men blinded by gas, men whose lungs had been damaged by phosgene or mustard gas, men whose skin had been burned by the vesicant agents that settled on surfaces and remained active for days. Those men populated the base hospitals and the hospital ships and the rehabilitation wards in numbers that the official casualty statistics organized under the heading chemical casualties with the same efficiency that they organized all other categories. The gas war produced its own bureaucratic habits. The forms for recording gas casualties were developed and standardized. The medical protocols for treating the different agents were written and distributed. The equipment issue for protective masks was tracked and managed. The gas was used with the same logistical professionalism as every other weapon, and the casualties it produced were processed with the same administrative thoroughness. The weapon that everyone who used it knew was causing a category of suffering that no military doctrine had previously contemplated was incorporated into the operational planning of every army on the Western Front as a standard element of the tactical toolkit, and the men who deployed it and the men who suffered it were all handled by the same administrative systems that handled everything else. The 16th habit concerns the relationship between the senior command and the junior officers who carried out their orders in the forward areas, and specifically the way that the institutional culture of the major armies managed the professional consequences of dissent. Junior officers in the British, French, and German armies were trained to execute orders, to believe that the senior command had information and perspective that the junior officer could not have, and that therefore made the order, however apparently senseless from the perspective of the man being asked to carry it out, likely correct in ways he could not see. This was not merely a cultural assumption. It was enforced through the promotion system, through the performance evaluation system, through the social dynamics of the officer class. An officer who publicly questioned an order, who wrote reports that reflected poorly on the planning of the operation, who expressed doubts about the feasibility of objectives to his superiors, was not an officer who could expect a successful career. And so a particular form of institutional silence developed. Junior officers carried out attacks that they knew from the ground-level tactical situation were very likely to fail. They wrote the after-action reports in language that attributed the failure to enemy resistance or to circumstances beyond their control rather than to the planning, because attributing failure to planning was attributing failure upward, was creating a record that implicated superiors, was doing something that the institutional culture of the military punished reliably. The result was that the information that might have interrupted the cycle, the honest tactical assessments, the frank acknowledgements that the artillery had not cut the wire and the men had no chance of reaching the objective, that information was systematically filtered out at every level of the reporting chain, and the headquarters that planned the next offensive worked from reports that described the last offensive in terms that obscured the specific features of its failure most relevant to preventing the next one. The 17th habit involves the animals of the First World War, which is a subject that receives occasional sentimental attention in popular histories, but whose institutional dimensions are rarely fully explored. The armies of the First World War were heavily dependent on animal labor in ways that the mechanization of later conflicts has made it easy to forget. Horses and mules pulled the artillery, carried supplies, moved the wounded, and performed the logistical functions that the internal combustion engine would eventually take over. There were approximately 8 million horses killed in the First World War. That number is frequently cited as a way of giving a sense of the scale of the conflict, but what is less frequently discussed is the institutional relationship between the armies and those animals, and what it reveals about the logic of the war. Horses were expensive. They were valuable military assets. The veterinary services that cared for them were significantly better resourced in some periods than the medical services that cared for the men. The records of horse casualties were often more detailed and more carefully maintained than the records of human casualties, because horses had a unit cost that had to be accounted for in the supply system in a way that men, whose value to the military supply system was absorbed into the recruitment and training budget rather than being tracked as a recurring inventory item, did not. The logic that produced meticulous records of horse casualties and less meticulous records of the human cost of specific engagements is not the logic of men who valued animals over people. It is the logic of an administrative system that processed animals and people through different bureaucratic frameworks based on their different relationships to the supply chain. And what the comparison reveals is not sentiment, but accounting. The 18th habit concerns the management of prisoners of war, specifically the gap between the formal legal framework that was supposed to govern the treatment of prisoners under the Hague Conventions and the actual conditions that prisoners experienced in ways that the formal reports do not fully capture. Both sides maintained prison camps that were formally compliant with the requirements of the conventions and that in practice operated at a level of resource provision that was, for most of the war, primarily determined by the availability of resources rather than the requirements of law or humanity. German prisoners in France and Britain were better fed in periods when the home population was also relatively well fed, and worse fed as the Allied naval blockade tightened its grip on German supply lines and the material available for everyone, including prisoners, declined. British and French prisoners in Germany were worse fed as the German food situation became increasingly desperate in the later years of the war. What the prisoner of war experience reveals about the habits of the war is the way that the formal legal framework functioned as a kind of administrative buffer between the institutions and the reality they were managing. The reports that were exchanged through neutral intermediaries, through the Swiss, through the ICRC, documented conditions in terms that were calibrated to the formal requirements of the legal framework. Formal compliance was maintained at a level sufficient to prevent formal legal consequences, while actual conditions varied with the availability of resources in ways that the formal framework did not effectively constrain. The men in the camps experienced those conditions. The institutions managed the paperwork. The 19th habit is one that connects the front to the home front through the bodies of the men who were released from service before the end of the war, either through wounds that were serious enough to produce permanent discharge or through the end of the conflict itself. The men who came back carried the war in their bodies and their minds in ways that the systems that received them were almost entirely unprepared to handle. The pension systems that were supposed to support disabled veterans were, in the British case, deliberately designed to be administratively demanding in a way that reduced the number of successful claims. The burden of proof was on the veteran to demonstrate that his condition was service-related, and the standard of proof was set at a level that many men with legitimate disabilities could not meet. Men with conditions that were clearly the result of their service, clearly documented in their medical files, were assessed at pension levels that reflected the administrative judgment that their disability did not represent the full cost they were claiming, and the appeal processes that were available to them were slow and expensive, and required resources that many of them did not have. The psychological casualties faced an additional layer of administrative obstruction because the pension system did not have a framework for compensating psychological disability that was equivalent to the framework for physical disability. Men who had been physically destroyed by the war had a clear, visible, documentable claim. Men who had been psychologically destroyed had a claim that the system was designed, through its assessment procedures and its evidentiary requirements, to minimize. The rate of successful pension claims for psychological disability in the years immediately after the war was significantly lower than the rate for physical disability, not because the psychological disabilities were less severe, but because the administrative system that evaluated them was built on assumptions about the nature and provability of psychological injury that systematically disadvantaged the claimant. The 20th habit is perhaps the most abstract, but historians return to it consistently because it runs through everything else. It is the habit of narrative, of the production and management of meaning by the institutional apparatus of the war and by the societies that sent men into it. The war produced from its very beginning an enormous volume of official narrative, of stories about what the war was for and what it meant and how the sacrifices it demanded should be understood. Those stories were produced by governments, by churches, by newspapers, by official propaganda agencies that were created specifically for the purpose of managing the relationship between the population and the war. They were calibrated to maintain the support for the war that the continuation of the war required, and they were refined in response to events in ways that preserved the essential framework. The war is necessary and meaningful, and the deaths in it are honorable, and the cause is just, even as the specific events they were being asked to explain became progressively harder to frame in those terms. The habit of narrative production was not abandoned when the war ended. It continued through the commemoration process, through the construction of memorials, through the official histories, through the decisions about which documents would be made public and when, through the language of the armistice and the peace treaties and the speeches at the unveiling of memorials. The official narrative of the First World War, the one that emphasized sacrifice and honor and the necessity of the conflict, was maintained not through any single deliberate deception, but through the accumulated effect of thousands of institutional decisions about how to frame, what to emphasize, what to defer, and what to record. And the effect of that accumulated institutional narrative is that the actual institutional habits of the war, the ones described in this account, remained obscured in the official record long enough to become historical problems rather than contemporary ones, which is to say long enough for the people who had committed them to be dead, which is to say long enough for them to become history rather than accountability. The 21st habit is the one that connects most directly to the long aftermath of the war, and it concerns the medical fate of men who were exposed to the industrial chemicals of the Western Front, not as gas casualties in the formal sense, but as occupants of an environment that was saturated with the products of 4 years of industrial-scale explosive and chemical weapons use. The soils of the former Western Front are, to the present day, contaminated with heavy metals, unexploded ordnance, and chemical agents at levels that have required permanent agricultural restriction in some areas, and that continue to produce casualties among agricultural workers and construction crews who encounter buried shells. The men who lived and fought in that environment for extended periods were exposed to soil and water contaminated with lead and arsenic and the breakdown products of explosive compounds, and the long-term health effects of that exposure were never systematically studied in the years after the war. Veterans who developed conditions in the decades following the conflict had no framework for connecting those conditions to their service, because the medical follow-up that might have established those connections was not done, and the administrative systems that might have tracked the long-term health of veterans were not built, because the administrative interest of the governments involved was in closing the files rather than expanding them. The 22nd habit is the last, and in some ways the simplest. It is the habit of counting the dead, counting the wounded, counting the shells fired and the ground taken, and the prisoners captured, and the equipment lost. Every army on every front maintained running casualty counts that were reported up the chain of command on schedules that varied by the intensity of operations, but that were never interrupted. The counts were not always accurate. The pressures on unit commanders to report strength figures that reflected well on their commands meant that casualty figures were sometimes underreported, and the difficulty of accounting for men who were simply gone, who had disappeared in shellfire or in the mud without trace or witness, meant that the count was always an approximation. But the counting continued. The returns were filed. The figures were compiled at higher levels of command, and compiled again at the highest levels, and transmitted to the governments and used in the assessments that informed the decisions about the next operation. The entire machinery of operational planning rested on the figures produced by the counting, and the counting was a continuous, professional, systematic activity that ran without interruption from the first weeks of the war to the last day of it. When the armistice came on the 11th of November 1918, the counting did not stop. It shifted registers. The final casualty counts were compiled. The totals were calculated and entered into the official records and published in the official histories that appeared over the following years, and those totals, somewhere in the range of 17 to 20 million dead and another 20 million wounded when all theaters and all causes are included, those totals were recorded with the same administrative professionalism that the war had applied to everything else. The counting was accurate enough for the purposes it served. The purposes it served were bureaucratic and historical and political. The number itself, the The final sum of the counting was entered into the record and filed, and the filing was the last institutional act of a war that had normalized the treatment of human lives as units in an accounting system. And the accounting was closed, and the next war began to be prepared.